We come to the second presentation of 2014. And the title for this year's presentations is the Parayana. Para means beyond, or in this regard, in Sanskrit, it means across. It means bridging something that is a limitation or a gulf or a hiatus, and being able to bridge that. And yana is the way. So that one of the best translations of Parayana is the way across. And the original use of the Parayana, as we mentioned last week, came when they were recounting after not the death of the Buddha so much, it was called the parinirvana of the Buddha. And he was about 80 years old. And he lay down on his right side and passed. And there was a great deal of sorrow. In fact, the classic illustration of that, which I will bring next week, is that even the animals are crying. And everyone is just, the light has gone out of the world. And then the realization was that the light has gone out of all the worlds. And on deeper contemplation, it was realized that his basic teaching towards the end of his earthly career of teaching, he taught for 45 years. Non-stop, all the time, every day. It takes a tremendous amount of not just stamina, but it takes a peculiar kind of continuity to be able to do that. The continuity is one that is not a lineage of adding up the presentations, adding up the days, the weeks, the months, the years. As Shelley said in his great poem, days, months, weeks, they are the rags of time. But time, when it is purified to its first dimension, it is the primal dimension. It is spontaneously emergent out of the zero field of nature, but it was a fertile emptiness. It was a fertile zero that was spontaneously able to emerge energy, which registered itself as time. And as soon as time registered in its emergence, it instantly, because now there were instants, instantly blossoms into space. So that when Einstein began to theorize in the early 20th century on the Minkowski universe, where there was a fabric of time and space, he began to understand that that fabric was space-time and had a quality where whatever would come within space-time further would rest in the fabric of space-time, and that the more thusness that it had, the more it would impinge on space-time, on its fabric. And so for most of the universe, where there is more than just time blossomed into space, where there is phenomenality, where there is existence, that existence will curve space-time. So that the curvature of space-time is correspondent to its weight of phenomenality, its weight of existence. And the usual term of its weight is in terms of its gravity. And it was apparent in some of Einstein's math that if the gravity is immense, the distortion, the curvature of space-time will be so radical that given enough gravitational weight, it will sink a well into the fabric of space-time so that you have what later on was discovered and was indeed called by John A. Wheeler a black hole. That it is so heavy that space-time is curved in upon itself. It's not that it disappears or it's gone, it's just that what disappears is the phenomenality of it being able to emit light, to emit photons. And without the particles called photons, which is the carrier of electromagnetic spectrum energy, that phenomenal energy will not produce light. It will be darkness. It will be a curvature that has gone not just full circle, but full sphere. And so the black hole will still have its gravity. It's a tremendous weight in the rest of time-space, but it will not emit photons. What it does emit, though, is something that Stephen Hawking came up with, and it's called Hawking radiation, which occurs always in pairs. And we've come to understand that Lao Tzu and his Tao Te Ching, where he said, what cannot be spoken of as the Tao is Tao, but what can be spoken of at its deepest, it's paired. And we understand now in the early 21st century that the pairedness generally is symmetrical. And so the symmetry is so strong that it exceeds the curving of something in upon itself to become darkness, like a black hole. Nevertheless, it still has its gravity, and that there then is the understanding that something which is invisible in the universe but has gravity, that its original field is more subtle, is of a higher dimension than black holes even, and gravity even. And so while there is a darkness which still has gravity, there is a field of origin out of which even gravity occurs, and it's that field out of which space occurs, it's that field out of which time occurs, and the space is the precursor of matter, which is the phenomenality of existence, but it is preceded instantly, as it were, by time, and time is emerged not instantly, not causally, but spontaneously out of formlessness. The Sanskrit word for that is shunyata. And shunyata pairs in a grand symmetry with what does occur, and occurs such that we occur as that, and the Sanskrit word for that is tathata. tathata. So that tathata and shunyata are not just a symmetrical pair, but they're a supersymmetry. And we know now from string theory and from other highfalutin, high dharma mathematics that supersymmetry has a very peculiar way which beggars understanding. Our logical systems cannot comprehend that. Our minds, which are trying to school themselves into those logical systems, cannot countenance it at all. And the polite way to say it used to be that it's a mystery. Or to skirt the issue, the almost impolite way is to say it's magic. Oh, that's magic. It is beyond, it is on the other shore from where there's even mystery or magic. And the Buddha talked about how nirvana is the completeness on this shore, but that there is an other shore. And crossing over to that other shore, the death experience is cushioned contextually by a whole cycle of something superior to life, which is a rebirth back again into life. But that there is a further triple high dharma context in which even rebirth no longer needs to reoccur. That not only is there a nirvana, but there's like a super-strang high dharma nirvana, where the realization is not a realization anymore, but is simply real. The qualities of the Parayana is to cross over by a way. A way, yana in Sanskrit, connotates a vehicle. There's something within which a vehicle that one is able to go on the way. And in the way that yana first came into play was because of the origins of a very powerful architect who had high dharma elicited and brought out of him, and that was St. Thomas. Didymus Judas Thomas, Thomas the twin, the doubting Thomas, one of the disciples of Jesus, the living Jesus. And we talked about how Thomas was an architect probably in Damascus, ancient Damascus, in Syria, and was enormously interested in a special kind of spiritual architecture, and would have become acquainted with the father of Jesus, Joseph, who was not just a carpenter, but everything that ensued from that. Joseph was not only in charge of doing what carpenters do to make furniture or wood frames or everything up to architecture, up to making buildings, up to making many other things, which required getting the origin of wood, which is trees. And the best trees for really high, important architecture were the cedars of Lebanon. And there was a great connection with the king of the Phoenicia that included what is today Lebanon and all of the cedars. And his seat of power, his name was Hiram, his seat of power, his royal palace, was in a coastal city called Tyre, Tyre. And there was this tremendous ability in Tyre to use the cedars of Lebanon to compose in an adjunct city called Sidon, to compose those great cedars of Lebanon into the kind of planks that could be positioned and put together in the architecture not of buildings but of ships. And so in Sidon, the first really great ships were made. And they were made under direction of the king of Tyre, because it was the Tyrian explorers and navy, as it were, which had gone out, far out on the Mediterranean Sea, by far out not only 100 miles offshore or 1,000 miles offshore, but had gone all the way through 2,000 miles of the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar and out into the Atlantic Ocean. By 1000 BC. Eventually, the Phoenician trading colonies, because they were not colonies that were established on the land, the Tyrians were too smart to know you don't take land away from other people, but what you do is you make a lease on some island that's offshore by which you can come and dock your boats with their goods, and you can trade to get their goods and take them away and then return in this cycle. And so the Phoenician use of offshore islands was cued because Tyre itself was of that archetypal shape. The power of Tyre, its shipping, wealth, and they were really wealthy, but also its great courage to go sailing into the Atlantic Ocean 3,000 years ago. They went as far south on the west coast of Africa as the Cameroons, that's near Nigeria. Senegal, which is a little sliver of country that's in that Nigerian, Cameroon area, it has an offshore island called Gorée, and that was one of the farthest African ports of the Tyrians. And Gorée was the place in which all the great commerce took place for thousands of years. And oddly enough, when the product of that region of Africa that became the most lucrative, that was the slave trade. And so the slaves were herded off the continent of Africa and incarcerated into holding pens and prisons on Gorée. And there they were collected by great ships that carried them off to wherever the slaves were going to be marketed and sold. And so there arose a bastardization of the wonderful facility and powers of Tyre, of Sidon, of the cedars of Lebanon, of that whole region, of which the largest trade city going east was Damascus. Damascus and Aleppo on near the coast, but Damascus was really the great trade city, and it was there that St. Thomas was from, and one of his close friends, almost a spirit companion, was named Thaddeus. And both Thomas and Thaddeus were disciples, 2 of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And they were from that area and spoke those languages, all of the trade languages, so that later on, when disciples were sent out after the crucifixion and then resurrection of Jesus, after a while, the disciples were sent out to spread the word, to distribute the way. Jesus always called his, not just the teaching, but the way. The way. This is the way. Not a doctrine, not an ideology. It wasn't a religio, a binding. It wasn't a religion. It was the way. It was a yana. It was a vehicle of endeavor which is shareable on whatever population or whatever distribution of population that there is. Nothing else comes to divide the way, and nothing else divides the yana. And so the Parayana is a refinement that was waiting in the wings that came in with the Mahayana. And it was St. Thomas who began with the seed of the way of the living Jesus that became the great way, the Mahayana, in India. He landed at Kerala on the south coast, the Malabar coast of the pointing tip of India, and had been invited by the king of one of the great Greco-Indian kingdoms. The king was named Gandophares. Phares is actually a name of honor that's derived from the ancient Iranians. There are many so-and-so Phares. This Gandophares had written a letter to the living Jesus to send someone to build him a suitable palace for his kingdom, also among all the other languages that they spoke and wrote. Greek was the basic language that united them with the western part of the world, and he wanted somebody who knew Greek and was a good architect and could build him a suitable palace to reach out to many different people. Thomas, of course, went from Kerala by ship up the coast of India, all the way to the Indus River and up the Indus River to the place at which Gandophares had his capital, and that area was called in ancient times Gandhara. And it was a place where Greek kings had ruled since the time of Alexander the Great. Thomas got to India in 41 AD. By the time he got to Gandhara, it was about 42 AD. And by that time, almost 300 years of Indo-Greek kings had reigned. And those Indo-Greek kings were distributed all through not only North India, but wherever Alexander had gone, especially into Central Asia. And so the more powerful Gandharian Indo-Greek kings always wanted to extend their kingdoms so that they went into Central Asia. And Gandophares, while he was trying to conquer in Central Asia for a year and came back, he found that Thomas had not built a palace for him. He said, "What have you done with the money?" And he said, "I have distributed it to all the people, who now are the people, are your palace." And he threw Thomas into prison. And while he was there, wondrous miracle things happened. That one of the jailed people was very famous for knowing about South India, not the Malabar coast, but on the other east coast. And the big coming city there was, for many, many centuries, called Madras. It's now called Chennai. And Madras was uniting the Tamil people of the very southern tip of India in an interface with those going a little bit more to the north. And so Madras became one of the great international ports of the ancient world, and very sophisticated as one would find in Damascus or in Alexandria or in Rome, wherever many kinds of people were doing business with scores of different kinds of people and were amazingly refined. One of my really good friends in San Francisco was a Madrasi, and I remember inviting him and his wife to a little dinner. I had a cottage I was renting up in the Oakland Hills near an old college there, and I had invited my Chinese professor, Kai Shu, and his French wife. And when they came, they realized that they were both internationally savvy about all kinds of things. And it was hard not to listen and to get a word in edgewise because they knew all kinds of things. And when I got to Calgary, Alberta, one of the first persons I met was Professor Ranbir Vora, who was from Madras, and his wife, Meena, who was the greatest cook in the world. And I asked her one time, I said, Meena, why do you not write a cookbook? She said, I don't know what I'm doing. I go by smell and taste, and I don't know from one meal to the next. I just do it. That's a Madrasi. That's the refinement. That's the high Dharma. There is no plan. Plan? There is no plan. We're busy. We're busy exploring that how to do it will spontaneously emerge in time, which will be fertile enough to generate the space within which phenomenality and existence can occur. And so, for the Parayana of 2014, there is no plan, but it will occur, and spontaneously. The Mahayana that Thomas seeded became a reality in terms of a written book. And the author of that was Ashvaghosha, who, when he was born as a very clever Brahmin, who was like a super lawyer, he could argue anything, and Asva in Sanskrit, as I mentioned last week, is horse, and Gosha is the horse neighing. So he has the tremendous power of the horse in action, ready to go. And Ashvaghosha, his classic first book in the Mahayana is called the Shraddhopada Mahayana, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. And Shraddha, as faith, in Greek, faith is pistis. And you've all heard of faith, hope, and charity. The actual layering of it is faith, charity, hope. There is an audacity to hope because it's like a thrice greatest. It begins with faith, and it becomes distributed through charity. In Sanskrit, charity is the word for it is dana. And the first perfection, the first paramita, which is perfection. The first of the 6 paramitas is dana. It means givingness, giftingness, not just giving, but gifting. And dana begins the perfection that eventually becomes the high dharma. But in order to do it, one needs to have not just the dana, but one needs to have also a quality called sila in Sanskrit. And it means that it is patiently endeavoring. The paramita for that is kashanti. The faithfully endeavoring is endeavoring in a continuity, not in some kind of a causality. You're endeavoring because of or to get to. It's just endeavoring. And kashanti is that patience, and that patience owes its original understanding to the book of Job in the Old Testament. And the book of Job is not like an ancient book. It's not a Mosaic book. It's not part of the Pentateuch. It's not like Genesis, Exodus, etc., etc. It's not a part of the prophets. It has a quality that cites it with the Megillah, which is the 5 wisdom books, but the book of Job is almost by itself. In fact, the only other book in the Old Testament that is similar in the sense of related to it is the book of Daniel. Because the author of the book of Job was also the author of the book of Daniel and was author of a book that only exists in fragments, which was the book of Noah. And Noah, Job, and Daniel were the 3 archetypal just men in the eyes of God. They were present with the angel of the presence that constantly is there in the presence of God. And the author of these, we do not know his name, but he most certainly was born and raised in Alexandria, and was raised in Alexandria in the later 200s BC. And by the time that he had written the book of Job and written the book of Noah, he had a council of those who surrounded him, who amplified what he was able to write, what he was able to impart, what he was able to share. And they went from Alexandria back to Palestine, back to Jerusalem, back to Judea. And they became the seed that developed as the Essenes. And the Essenes were the active life, whereas in Alexandria, the symmetry, the supersymmetry to the Essenes were the healers, the therapeutes, the therapeutai, those who by contemplation healed all. Whereas the Essenes made sure that the ancient writings were fulfilled, that they were purified, that their lives were purified, that they were able to live as a community that was trustworthy to pass on the writings, the teachings, in embodiment in the way of living purely, and that some of those Essenes who were not marginal, but who were intermediate with Alexandria, with the contemplatives, were able to marry. And Joseph's father, Jesus' father Joseph, was one of the marrying semi-Essenes, semi-therapeutes. And when the newborn Jesus was threatened by the insane jealousy, the old Herod increasingly was mad. He killed, sacrificed his two best sons because he suspected they were trying to kill him to take over. They were going to take over anyway, but they were trying to kill him, so he killed them. And he's the one who ordered every infant male under 2 years old be slaughtered, because he was told by the 3 traveling magi who had come bearing gifts to witness the birth by the stars. The star had risen and a universal king was being born. In Sanskrit, in ancient times, what was understood is that in supersymmetry to a Buddha is a universal king. In Sanskrit, the name of a universal king is a Chakravartin. The chakras, but this is a master, a Chakravartin of all the chakras that there are and all of their powers. And this Chakravartin is able to bring them not through the integral of the chakras, or even the massive integral of the set of the chakras, but to a distillation of the whole meaningfulness and capacity to have new chakras that come into being, because a Chakravartin or a Buddha in their supersymmetry have brought this out of reality into time, into space, into existence, and that this is something that transcends mystery farther than mystery transcends does the chicken or the egg come first. Let's take a break.